Just imagine you are waiting in line at the grocery store, and directly behind you in line is another customer. You turn around, you lock eyes, and you decide to have a little small talk. This chit chat goes back and forth, and then you quickly realize that this person is your target audience of your podcast. You immediately think, I need to sell them on my show, but then you realize you're not a salesman.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? Thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You know, you can find out every single thing about that show on a website, which I built. Yeah, you can go ahead and check that out if you want to at chrisandchristineshow.com. A link to it in the show notes of this very episode. You know, scroll on down, and there it is. But hey, enough about me. How are you doing? How is that podcast of yours coming along? You know, did you even start that podcast? You know, you said you were going to. I heard you. You said, yeah, I'm going to start a podcast in 2024. But guess what? We just turned into March of 2024. It is March 1st right now as I record this very episode, which means you had 2 whole months to get that podcast off the ground. How's that going? Hey, what do you think are maybe the biggest challenges that you come across when you're designing a podcast from the ground up? I know for me, it basically was all the tech and all the gear, like figuring out like, how do I make it record? Like, how do I physically talk and make it sound good on a recording? Then how do I enhance that recording and make it sound amazing? Maybe add some elements like some sound effects, some music, different things, package it all together, save it as a finished MP3. How do I take that little MP3 file and put it into some kind of like storage system on the cloud somewhere, aka a media host? And then from there, you know, get it sent out to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the regular players that you can create a podcast and make it enjoyable for the entire world. Now, that was always my problem, was trying to figure out, like, how do I get from point A to point Z, which would be the finished product in your earbuds. But today in 2024, there are so many podcasting tools that are centered around AI services that will pretty much do almost anything for you when it comes to your podcast. I mean, almost anything at all. So there's probably today, I would say there's almost no excuse at all to have bad sounding audio for your audio podcast. I mean, there are so many AI generated enhancement tools. Like I use the Adobe Enhance. That works. There's Descript. There's a great feature in there called Studio Sound, which will make almost any kind of audio sound decent. I mean, it's not as good. It's always good to have good equipment to start with. One classic saying has always been garbage in, garbage out. But I would say maybe now it's like garbage in and we'll get you something somewhat decent out on the backside using all these wonderful AI tools that are out there right now. So it's kind of almost impossible right now to have a bad audio sounding podcast. And because of these things, I feel that Podtastic Audio, this podcast here, which originally started as a show to help you create amazing audio for your podcast, where I have kind of shifted the show over the last few months to kind of steer away from the basics of how to plug in a microphone and which end of a microphone to really talk into. Now, I mean, we pretty much can all figure that out by now. But if you still need help, you still cannot figure out how to make decent sounding audio from your audio podcast, then you are free to use any of the number of AI generated tools that are out there at your disposal. But today we're going to go beyond the actual and physical creation of your content. Now, your content can be a YouTube channel. Your content can be an Instagram page. It can be, yes, and even an audio podcast like this one is right now. We're going to move past that, and we're going to take the physical content that we have, and we're going to try to put it in front of our ideal audience. Now, it's always good for you to figure out who your ideal audience really is. If you do not know who your audience is, then you need to decide who would best benefit from listening to your show. In other words, who is your content directly for? Who did you make this show for? You could not make it for everybody because not everybody likes everything. It's just the way it is. So who specifically is your show exactly for? And then once you kind of figure that out, the next easy logical step is to get in front of those people and tell them about your podcast. And that just seems to be the tricky part, is being a physical salesman to your own podcast to a complete stranger that you just met, like on the street or in the grocery store, somewhere in person, face to face. Now, I have done that a few times, and every time I've done it, I feel kind of like weird about it. I'm like, I don't know, should I talk about my podcast? Am I really saying too much? Am I bragging? Am I feeling kind of like a jerk? I don't know, because I'm not really a salesman. I've never been a salesman. My dad was a salesman. He was out of work at one point, and then the only jobs that were available seemed like they were salesman jobs, because salesmen have a pretty high turnover rate, especially those that work 100% off commissions. Now, what that really means is that when you sell something, you get a percentage of that sale. You sell nothing, you get paid nothing. It's not like an hourly or salary employee. So it's what they call it, either feast or famine. Feast, when you're doing great, you have a lot of sales, business is great. Or famine, when you're selling nothing and it's a dry market and it's nothing at all. But the good news is, when it comes to selling your podcast, your podcast is physically free. It does not cost the consumer anything at all to push play and listen to your podcast. It does cost them their time. And in some cases, time is actually worth more than money for some people. But let's just say you found somebody on the street, at the grocery store, and you're going to tell them about your podcast. How do you do it? How do you make that initial sales call? Well, today we are going to go over 5 top strategies on how you can be a better salesman for your podcast or anything really at all. But these are just basic sales strategies that salesmen put in place to sell you on a product. Now, you can put these same strategies in place for your show to physically sell your show on a potential new listener. So, kicking it off with number 1, and that is to understand your product or service inside out. Well, yeah, it's your show. You should know most about your show, what you talk about, who's on your show, and the content of your show. To sell effectively, you need to have a deep understanding of what you're selling. Know its features, benefits, advantages over competitors, and potential drawbacks. Understanding your product services allows you to effectively communicate its value to potential customers. Continuously educate yourself about your own product, aka your podcast, and stay updated on industry trends and developments. In other words, what are your competition doing? What are the other shows that are exactly like your show? What are they talking about? Hey, it's all about understanding the product inside and out. Okay, so moving on to strategy number 2 on how to be an effective salesman, and that is listen more than you speak. Now, this can be tricky as a podcaster. I know, as a podcaster myself, I like to talk. I can talk your ear off for days. Here we are in a podcast. I'm talking to you right now. But one of the most critical skills in sales is active listening. Listen carefully to your customers to understand, their needs, their pain points, and their preferences. In other words, find out who your audience is and how you can best serve them. Ask open-ended questions to encourage a dialogue and gather valuable information. This not only helps you tailor your pitch to meet their specific needs, but it also builds rapport and trust. And I've always said, and I'll say it again, trust is a very valuable thing. It's very hard to get, and it's very, very easy to destroy. Okay, so moving on to strategy method number 3 on how to be a better salesman is to focus on building relationships, which is what a podcast really is in the first place. It is a masterclass in building relationships with me to you to your audience. Building strong relationships with customers is key to long-term success in sales. People are more likely to buy from someone they trust and feel a connection with. Invest time in getting to know your customers on a personal level, understand their businesses, and show genuine interest in helping them solve their problems. Now, what this all means is all about delivering value directly to your audience. If your audience is suffering from something, if your audience has a pain point and you have the answer, then they're going to go directly to you for that answer. And then you say, hey, I've got a podcast. Check it out. Maybe this will help. Okay, moving on to strategy number 4 on how you can be a better salesman. Now, this is where it gets very interesting because this is, I would say, is possibly the turn when it comes to being a salesman. We're talking about mastering the art of persuasion. Now, you know what it's like to be persuaded to do something. You're thinking, I don't know if I should. I don't know if I should or should not. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I should. And they're like, you know what? Maybe you should. And they kind of persuade you to do something like that. Salesmanship involves persuading customers to take action, whether it's making a purchase or committing to a contract. Study persuasion techniques such as creating scarcity. Like, hey, my podcast is the only podcast in town that talks about these topics that'll help you solve your problem. Or I'm the only podcast here locally that's going to talk about the things that impact your business directly. You should check out my show. See what I did? It's the only one in town and you need help. Here I am. Also, on those same lines, it helps to have maybe some social proof, storytelling, and perhaps framing. Maybe you would like to highlight the value proposition of your product or service, aka your podcast, and demonstrate how it addresses the customer's needs and pain points. Like if they are stuck on something or they want to learn about something, your podcast serves that particular need. This is why it's so important to have a niched down podcast, because it's much easier to sell something that falls into that particular niche than a much broader scale thing. Because if your show covers a broad mismatch arrangement of all kinds of things, then there's no need for the scarcity mindset when it comes to selling your podcast because, well, it's just like a bunch of other million other podcasts that are covering the exact same thing. But if your podcast is specifically targeting and covering one particular pain point, well, then the sale process got much, much easier. And the 5th and final strategy on how you can become a better salesman and sell your product, aka your podcast, to potentially somebody you meet in person. And that would be to continuously improve and adapt your sales process. You know, the strategies that you use today, right now, to sell your podcast or your product or whatever you're selling, the things you do today may not work tomorrow. So you want to continuously seek feedback from the customers. That's why getting feedback from listeners is so important. I can't stress this enough. To get real, actual feedback on your podcast from somebody that is not related to you. And be open to learning from both successes and failures. Meaning, if your podcast is good in these areas, great. If it's not good in these areas, that's okay too. We can adjust that and we can fix it. Your podcast is never set in stone, is never permanent. You always can evolve your show. I've evolved this show. I've evolved the Chris and Christine show. It's okay to evolve. If one thing works one day, you can change it to something else later down the road. Nothing has to be the exact same thing from the very beginning you start your podcast. It can be changed to something completely different by the time you get to the 100th episode. But when it comes to sales, the sales part of this whole thing is, you can stay adaptable and flexible to your approach. Experiment with different sales techniques, strategies, and channels, aka maybe, social media or whatever, to see what works best for you and your customers, aka the listeners. Invest in your professional development by maybe attending sales training programs. There's lots of them online for free. Go on YouTube. I'm sure you can find all kinds of wonderful things. Maybe even some workshops. If you are a salesman, I'm sure there's salesman workshops. There's workshops for all kinds of different things. There's conventions for almost anything out there. So maybe if you go to these things, you can kind of work on your craft if you're going to be a physical salesman. Now, these salesman strategy tools I'm presenting to you today, they're mainly focused for being a salesman selling a product or service, but you can still use these strategies to physically sell your podcast to a potential new listener. And I know talking about your podcast to a complete stranger face to face can be very intimidating. It was for me the couple times that I have done it. And this is where it's always good to have either business cards that have a link to your podcast on them, or better than that is to have a pre-generated QR code that you have created and you saved on your phone as a picture. Save it in the favorites folder of your picture so you always have it available. And you pull that up and have a link directly to your website or your link tree, or maybe even to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, one of those two, because chances are if they're on an iPhone, they're going to go to Apple Podcasts. If they're on Android, they're probably going to go to Spotify. You know, there's probably 100 or 2,000, I don't even know how many different podcast apps available today right now. But I like to really live in the world of the big ones, like the Apple. I have an iPhone, I have a Mac computer. So guess what? I listen to everything on Apple. But I do realize there are a lot of other apps out there. Podcasting 2.0. It's all about the, value for value, where you can send Bitcoin currency through the app directly and do a lot of other cool things too. But I know Apple doesn't really do that, and a lot of other ones do. But I just like the way Apple does it. It's simple. It works. It works on everything I have. Hey, I'm all about simplicity. And if it's simple and it works and it sounds great and it does everything I need it to do, then I am cool and I'm good to go. But I do realize there are other apps out there. So it's probably best if you do have a physical website or landing page for your podcast and you have a QR code created directly for that page, which will work on whatever device they have, whether it's Android or Apple. They do the little QR code scanner thing right on your phone because you're right there in person. And you say, oh, yeah, here it is. You want to check it out? Here, I got the QR code for my podcast right here. Just take a picture of this thing in your phone at this thing right here on my phone. And then instantly, oh, there's your show. It's right there in front of me. Yeah, check that out. Oh, your first episode is right there right now. I can push play on it and listen to it right now. You sure can. And that is how you do that. And that's pretty much all there really is to it. But you really want to steer them to becoming a subscriber. I mean, pressing play on a podcast one time, which is probably going to happen a lot over the course of your podcast lifetime, you'll have more people pressing play one time than two times. So it's so important to get them to stick around and stay for the next episode by having them press subscribe on your podcast. So maybe better than sending them directly to a player is figure out if you can send them to a place that actually has a subscribe button built in. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we even get there, we need to make sure we have the initial conversation with that person and get them to even acknowledge that we exist and acknowledge that we even have a podcast and kind of sell them on the idea of listening to your podcast. And whether or not you are physically selling any services or products at all with your podcast, you still have to physically sell the actual podcast itself to new listeners. And that is always the tricky part. So I want to say thank you once again for being here today. I really do appreciate you listening to this podcast. I make this show directly for you so you can create an amazing podcast for your audience. That's what it's all about. And being that we're talking about sales today and selling your podcast to potentially new listeners, hey, can you do me a favor? Can you press the share button on your app right now and share this episode to somebody that potentially can use it? Maybe another podcaster buddy of yours that's creating a podcast that may need help making an amazing show. Just share this episode with them. That will help me out and it'll help them out and it'll help you out. Be cool. Like, man, thank you so much for sharing this amazing stuff to me. I really appreciate it. You are awesome. We're all awesome. We're all in this together. And if you stick around, you will find me on the very next episode. And until then, happy podcasting.